You are listening to Talky Nonsense, a grab bag of bonus discussions short and long about issues small and large, and today, Smokey is going to regale us with the story of St. David, who you've probably never heard of, but is world famous, especially in Wales. Tell us why.
Why we are discussing him or why he's famous?
Hopefully you're going to tell us both.
Okay, well the reason we are discussing him is because I made a New Year's resolution this year to cook 20 new Asian dishes, which I realise is a wide net, Asia being vast and diverse. I ended up mostly doing Chinese and Vietnamese, and I got right into it and ended up finishing around mid-February, so I kind of wanted to find the next thing to do. So I was thinking, should I do 20 African dishes or what have you, and ended up thinking it could be quite fun to do 20 liturgical dishes, so foods that were based around various feasts or festivals, saints' days, etc. And the next feast that was sort of coming up when I started looking up feasts, I mean, there are a million because there are a million saints and they all have a saint's day, and many days are like 4 saints' days. But they don't all have interesting foods associated with them. But March the 1st was St. David's Day. He is the patron saint of Wales. So I thought for church lunch we could have a Welsh feast, which we did.
Probably won't have again.
I won't say that Welsh cuisine immediately grabbed us by the throat. It was very leek-based. It was sort of probably very nice if it was raining.
No doubt very worthy.
Very filling. Bill Bryson once described British sweet food in general as cautiously flavourful. That is an accurate description. Anyway, St. David, I ended up looking him up so I could, tell the long-suffering church folks why we were doing this thing. And he's actually very interesting, so I thought I would tell you too.
Yes, well, he is not only interesting, but he stimulates interesting thoughts about interesting topics, as we will discover.
St. David was a real person. We are very sure he existed. But as is so often the case with these early saints, what we know about him is a bit iffy. Our chief source is a guy called Rygivark, who lived 500 years later. And Rygivark was, we think, the bishop of St. David's Cathedral, and he wrote a book, a hagiography, about St. David. And he claimed that it was based on earlier manuscripts. He claimed to have done all this research, and he'd found various documents that had survived the depredations of the Vikings and pirates and were getting all moth-eaten, and he felt it was time to kind of put them together before they finally disappeared. It could be true. We don't have those manuscripts, and it's always a bit dubious with a hagiography what is even intended to be factual and what is just straight up.
More importantly, if it is true, it is suspiciously tall in the tail.
A lot of stuff happened to this guy. Now, I have to admit, I also had never heard of St. David before I looked him up. Turns out he is a huge deal. We all know about St. Patrick being the patron saint of Ireland, but it turns out he's only one of 3. St. David is the patron saint of Wales. And he is still buried, I think. His relics are still there, but the various accoutrements have been kind of demolished at various points when people realised he was being idolised. But the place where he founded a monastery still exists. It is the smallest city in Britain. It had around 1,750 people in the 2021 census. It is called a city because it has a cathedral, not because it's in any other way worthy of the name. And St. David's Cathedral is also quite important. I never heard of that either. But it was, back in its day, this huge site of pilgrimage, and Pope Calixtus II in the 1100s declared that 2 pilgrimages to St. David's was worth 1 pilgrimage to Rome, and if you visited 3 times, that was the equivalent of going all the way to Jerusalem.
Convenient.
I know, this is quite fascinating maths here. I feel like if you had just this little local church around the corner that had maybe, the finger bone of a very minor saint, could you just go there like 500 times, and that would be also equivalent to 1 Rome? Is it like a coupon system? How does this work? At any rate, St. David's fame started even before his birth, which was foretold to St. Patrick 30 years in advance by an angel. We think he was born around 500 AD. Ish, very ish. And the principal legend surrounding his birth was that his mother was a nun called
Non.
And she was possibly the niece of King Arthur, so, there's pedigree going on here. Now, regrettably, she was raped by a passing king and thus gave birth to David. The most famous prospect for his father was King Sant, which means saint, and since Non means none, it's very possible that these weren't actually their real names, they're just kind of placeholder names, because the esteemed parents of St. David would have these great names. Although why his father would get to be esteemed, considering the circumstances, I do not know. Now, we do know that St. Non, whatever her real name was a real person. She was a saint in her own right, so she had relics, she had a shrine and a chapel and everything. She even had a holy well, which was used to cure the insane by throwing them backwards into it.
Classic.
Yeah.
Your standard method of curing insanity. At least in Britain.
You'd be less likely to claim insanity if you thought that might happen to you. And during her pregnancy, during which she lived off bread and water, She walked into a church.
Healthy.
I mean, I don't know if it was
The
sort
non-diet.
of in penance for having been raped. It's all very strange. But she walked into a church and the man preaching found himself struck dumb and unable to preach. And this was taken as a sign that the child in her womb was going to himself be a great preacher. Now, there was some local ruler or other. In some versions, this is David's father, but it could also just be some guy who got wind of this, and he feared the power of the child in a kind of Herodian way and planned to kill him. But God saved young David by raising up a great storm when St. Non went into labour, so that nobody could get to her. She was surrounded by torrential wind and rain, but the hilltop where she gave birth alone was dry and bathed in a golden light. That does not mean, however, that it was an easy delivery. The legend says that she was in such anguish during her labour that she raked the stone beneath her with her fingernails and left marks, and then the stone itself split in two as she crushed it, in sympathy with her pain.
That sounds legitimate.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, the split rock is no longer around, but there is, or was at some point at least, a spring that also gushed forth at the place of his birth. People would pilgrimage to this. I'm not entirely sure why the person who wanted David dead gave up at that point, since he was still, a very killable infant of small size. But anyway, seems to have given up.
Perhaps he fled to Egypt?
Could have done. St. Non brought her son up herself and founded a convent. She was possibly later martyred by druids, but we don't really know.
Those druids, always causing trouble.
Well, remember, this is very early on, so 500-ish. There were druids all over the show. David was baptized as a baby by St. Elvis, who had been nursed by a she-wolf.
All the most famous people were nursed by she-wolves.
Yeah. And he was taught as a young chap by an elderly blind monk called Paulinus, whose sight the young David restored by making the sign of the cross over his eyelids. And at any rate, he was acknowledged very young to be a gifted preacher, and he was sent around as a teacher and a preacher, kind of a missionary, who founded many churches and an order of monasteries, they reckon sort of 10 to 12 monasteries, in and around Wales, including what are now Devon and Brittany, so bits of England and so on as well. His monasteries were, at least initially, quite hardcore. He kind of favoured the Egyptian desert fathers' approach of asceticism, and his monastic rule was of poverty. The monks only ate bread, salt and herbs, and they had to pull their own ploughs instead of using draft animals. The idea was this would subject them to divine fatigues.
Sounds like he took after his mother.
Yeah, they were not big on the finer things of life. He was big on the communal living thing, so to the point where even saying my book was a punishable offence. It was our book.
Oh, David.
And in fact, he didn't really like people saying anything at all. They were meant to pray a lot, but they were supposed to spend most of their time in silence. And this whole asceticism gig didn't always go down very well with the monks. At one point, one lot became so dissatisfied with his rules that they decided to poison him.
That's an 8th commandment violation, David.
It's not good.
That's a 6th commandment violation, monks.
Yeah,
so
well...
not really improving this. This doesn't sound like the most Christian monastery.
It's not a great advertisement for monasticism.
Socialism ending in murder of the tyrant. It sounds like the Soviet Union.
Well, fortunately for David, St. Scudian from Ireland got wind of this in a vision, and he rode across the sea on the back of a sea monster to warn him. So David blessed the poisoned bread, ate it, and suffered no ill effects.
Did he bless the sea monster also?
I don't know. There's also one story about him travelling on a sea monster at some point. Just the way to get around.
A lot of people around then did travel on sea monsters, especially saints. It's actually quite interesting.
Well, anyway, David, for all his hard line, he followed it himself. He practiced what he preached. He is sometimes known as David the Water Drinker or Aquaticus. Love that. Superhero name. Because he drank nothing but water. There's another legend that says he only ate leeks, but this kind of contradicts the story in which the monks poisoned his bread, so you just kind of pick your poison there, as it were. He was also known to stand neck deep in cold water in a lake while reciting scripture as a penance.
I don't think you could live on nothing but leeks.
I don't think anyone around you would want you to live on nothing but leeks. He eventually, by these feats of valour, became an archbishop, possibly during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Hang on. Why couldn't he just pilgrimage to his own church 3 times?
That's true. He famously opposed Pelagianism in 2 synods. So this is the kind of the big thing he did, is he defeated Pelagianism in the Celtic world. First synod...
+1 for David on that point.
Yeah, totally.
Was a socialist, but not a Pelagian.
Yeah, there was the first one, which he spoke very eloquently. Apparently he was a very eloquent orator. And then during the second one, the Synod of Victory, they sort of definitively like, nope, not having that. And it was possibly during this second synod that he performed his most famous miracle. Now, if you want to be canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church, at least, which David was in 1120, you have to have done at least one miracle. You can't just be like a random good person. Miracle is required.
Not even if you stood up to your neck in a lake in cold water
No.
reciting the scriptures.
Not even if you did that every day. So St. David did a few, as we've heard, he did a few blindness.
Well, he blessed the poison bread.
He blessed the
You'd
poison
think
bread,
that would count.
He cleansed some tainted water, and it turns out that was in Bath. The legend is he went to Bath and fixed the water, which was poisonous, and then also made it nice and warm so that you could go and have baths there, and that's why we have Bath.
Again, that seems like quite a legitimate miracle. Why did they not accept these ones?
Well, I don't know if they didn't accept them. It's just not the one he's most famous for.
This is not the one that we shall canonize him for.
Well, no, I mean, he may have been canonized for any of them, but it's just his most famous one is not this.
Very
but anyway,
strange.
the point is he needs to go back to Bath because the water is once again tainted and you can't actually bath in the Roman baths anymore because you would die. He brought a child back to life by splashing his face with his tears. That was nice. And yeah, a lot of blindness ones. He cured blindness several times, it seems. But his most famous miracle, weirdly, is quite tame. He was preaching one day, apparently, possibly during the synod, on a flat piece of ground, and the ground rose up under him to form a hill so that the people at the back could see him more clearly. As a rather acidic commentator has once said, he could scarcely conceive of any miracle more superfluous, because Wales is like covered in hills. He could have literally walked 10 steps to the left and just found a real hill. But so it apparently was, and as he preached on this hill, a white dove came and settled on his shoulder, and that became one of his emblems. So isn't that nice?
I do like doves. All of the white ones are the least favourite of all the doves.
But they are the most symbolic.
I suppose that is true.
Weirdly, his other emblem was a leek. And I'm not entirely sure why he chose it, but it is a common Welsh emblem. Now, this is all a bit lost in the mist of time, but the story goes that during a battle against Saxon invaders, the Welsh went out to fight, and since neither side had uniforms and it was quite difficult to tell friend from foe, the Welsh guys decided to recognise each other by everybody grabbing a leek from the garden and just putting it in his hat. And some legends say it was St. David himself who told them to do this. Leeks grow very well in Wales, that's why they're in all the food.
I find this legend extremely implausible because you have told me about the silly hats they wore that allowed you to be able to put a leek in them, and I can't believe that the opposing force also wore hats just like that. And if they didn't, that would be the only thing you'd need to identify friend from foe.
That's true. I cannot tell you, but some people also say the battle itself took place on a field of leeks, which would have been terrible for the leeks. But anyway, they won the battle. And to this day, apparently...
I would not fight amongst a field of leeks. You'd twist an ankle.
They get kind of slimy and slippery, don't they?
Yeah, you'd totally die.
But honestly, Wales is probably just... It would be wet and muddy
This is the
regardless.
best place we have for our battle.
If someone tries to kill you
worse.
atop a leek, you can't just refuse to fight because you're on a leek, you know? Anyway, they won. They won thanks, no doubt, to the power of the leeks. And to this day, the Welsh regiments will eat raw leeks on St. David's Day in memory of their brave, stinky forebears. They actually have a raw leek eating competition.
Nom.
Yeah. And later on, the
What
Welsh...
sort of a competition?
Speed and quantity, I imagine. What, finesse? What else would it be?
I'm just wondering how many raw leeks can one person really eat? And is that really the thing that you want to test?
I mean, you got to have a hobby. Later on, the Welsh archers, who were renowned for their skill, actually wore green and white uniforms in honour of the leek. So that's quite lovely. And since St. David being just the patron saint of Wales, on St. David's Day, March the 1st, it is customary for people to wear leeks to this very day. Apparently, they will send school kids off to school in like full Welsh miners' garb or whatever with a leek in their hat.
And because they're all dressed like that, no one gets beat up.
And also daffodils is the other symbol of Wales. And this could actually be a historical mistake because the Welsh words for leek and daffodil are almost the same. And it's possible that someone just read, our symbol is leek and went, that can't be right.
Must be a
Must
flower.
be a pretty flower that would look nice on a hat. And over time, so, David, after his death, he became increasingly a symbol of Welsh independence and national pride. And as such, while St. David's Day is a big celebration in Wales, historically it was also ridiculed in England. You had the Welsh expats having their celebrations and their parades, and the English, with their customary sensitivity and good taste, would respond with counter-celebrations. They would burn Welsh figures in effigy, and they would serve teffies, which are gingerbread cookies in the shape of a Welshman riding a goat.
To which the Welsh replied, "You really are the worst, brother."
The English, man! Samuel Pepys writes about this in his diary, which is interesting if you know about Samuel Pepys, who is interesting. Buried a cheese during the Great Fire of London so that it wouldn't come to harm.
Strange guy.
In his backyard, he was. Anyway, to this day, St. David's Day is not technically a public holiday, and the Welsh are kind of salty about that. They're trying to legitimise it. But it is still a pretty big thing, sort of like St. Patrick's Day. And Disneyland Paris, weirdly, has a whole Welsh week every year. I find that really fascinating because there would be a lot of countries you could celebrate, and like a whole week for Wales. Like, that's,
Perhaps they're trying to attract
impressive.
the Welsh. It's not that far from Wales to Paris.
I mean, yeah.
Still, it does seem like maybe something continental. I suppose they probably have all the continental ones as well.
I don't know if every
There's
single
52
week
weeks in a year.
I mean, they're big on
How
their
many
parades.
countries
and
can Europe
things.
have?
Anywho, St. David's last sermon is recorded, which is quite cool, and it was given just before his death, apparently at the age of 147, so, take that with a grain of skepticism, but it contains this exhortation, go nonny.
Be joyful and keep your faith and your creed. Do the little things that you have seen me do and heard about. I will walk the path that our fathers have trod before us.
And to this day, the Welsh people will console and exhort each other with this little wee saying, which I won't attempt to say in Welsh, do the little things. Isn't that nice?
I'm constantly telling my kids to do little things.
Now, there is one other kind of interesting legacy of St. David, and to get to there, we need to take a bit of a step sideways, and we're going to talk about corpse lights.
Of course.
Yes.
That's a natural segue.
Yep. So corpse lights are a phenomenon strongly associated with Wales, but appearing also in all sorts of places all over the world. They seem to be observed a lot in Britain and Northern Europe, but they're also in places as far-flung as the USA, Mexico, Bengal, Japan, even Australia. Essentially what they are travelling balls of light. They're usually bluish light. They're seen at night. They're often seen in marshy places. They are low to the ground, and they tend to move along a path of some kind and then disappear. Now, there are attempts at naturalistic explanations. The most common one is just marsh gas or swamp gas, which could be true. It just seems so cliched at this point. It's like, oh, yeah, swamp gas. It might be swamp gas.
Look into the light.
It's also been kind of dubiously theorized that it was something to do with the movement of tectonic plates and then quartz below the surface of the ground, and creating some kind of piezoelectric funkiness. I made a half-hearted attempt to figure out what this means scientifically, and then discovered that actually no one believes it. Anyway, that's sort of a bit of a Hail Mary there. There's also a rather lovely theory that these lights are barn owls, which have somehow gotten themselves covered in bioluminescent fungi. Except that there is no known bioluminescent anything that is actually as bright as these reports depict.
Pity.
Yeah, because that would be cool. Although, why they'd be rolling around in fungus anyway? I mean, yeah, it's a
just
bit
to
far-fetched.
freak people out.
So we really don't know.
Seen barn owls?
Well, they are creepy and silent. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
It could be, except that it isn't. So we really don't know. But what we do know is that these reports have been around for a long time, and folklore is just steeped with them. You might have heard of them as will-o'-the-wisps. Puck talks about them in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and they're the same wisps that lead Merida to her fate in the Pixar movie Brave. Corpse lights also appear in the opening chapter of Dracula, just for a bit of colour. They appear in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban as a creature called the Hinky Punk, which is not a name J.K. Rowling invented. It is a legitimate local name for the phenomenon. And of course they appear in The Lord of the Rings. They are the candles of corpses that Gollum warns the hobbits about in the Dead Marshes. Don't follow the lights. Now, what is striking about corpse lights is that there are many folkloric explanations for what they are, and they're almost universally negative, which is fair enough because they're creepy. Some traditions associate them with the souls of stillborn or unbaptized babies. Some consider them to be the souls of specific cursed individuals who have their own little kind of backstories and are doomed to roam the earth and lure travellers to their own doom for some reason. Quite commonly, they're considered to be supernatural entities in their own right, so not outright demons necessarily, but fae kind of creatures, very untrustworthy and tricksy. The one positive interpretation I found for these lights is that they may lead you to buried treasure, but much more commonly, people warned their friends like Gollum not to follow the lights, because they might lead you to the middle of a marsh and then suddenly lead you in the dark to stumble your way home and possibly fall in and drown. Or they might lead you to the very edge of a cliff. And at best, if they weren't outright malicious, they were mischievous. I rather like this variant in which the lights would find a courting couple on their front porch, knock over the lantern, and then make obscene kissing noises in the dark to shock the couple's parents. Now, again, there are tons and tons of different names for these lights, but I call them corpse lights because that is one of the names they're known by in Britain. And a very, very common interpretation in Britain was that these lights came out of or went into graves and travelled along corpse roads.
Tell us what a corpse road is, Smokey.
A corpse road is essentially just a road along which you carry a corpse. In Britain, not every church had the right to bury its own dead. There was money to be made in having a graveyard, so the little local churches were generally obliged to send their dead along to the larger mother churches in the area who had these exclusive burial rites. Bit of a get, isn't it?
Sounds kind of scammy.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes these were like miles away from your little local village. And you might think you could just take the corpse by the main road, but no, because early Britons, and I'm talking pre-medieval as well as medieval, and I'm talking Christians, at least nominal Christians, these people did not trust their dead. They believed that the dead had a propensity to return and haunt the living. They did not want this, and to avoid this you had to do certain things. You carried them to the graveyard feet first, so facing away from the house. They still do this in churches traditionally, don't they? You carry the coffin out feet first.
I would never have thought of
checking
which way the coffin was being carried.
It is still etiquette. You never laid the coffin down on the earth because spirits apparently kind of want to seep out into the ground and escape. So you have to have something between the coffin and the earth. So along the corpse road, you'd have coffin stones kind of periodically there, just big barely hewn stones that you could rest the coffin on to rest your arms.
So the stones don't conduct spirit, but
No.
the earth from which the stones
Stones
are
are
made
insulative. Earth is conductive.
spirit.
We all know this.
Okay. Just checking.
Incidentally, it would often have been the same coffin reused because you didn't want to waste wood or money, burying a perfectly nice coffin, so they would just kind of redo.
You tip the corpse in,
they would have
take
been
the coffin home.
Yeah, they would have been in a shroud, so it was all right. Much more eco-friendly.
Well, indeed.
Yeah. And you took the most important thing is that you would take your corpse by a corpse road. Now, there were two schools of thought on this. One was that the road should be as straight as possible. So sort of shooting the corpse off like an arrow into the beyond. So it wouldn't get distracted. It would just go, stay gone. And this occasionally made the roads quite difficult to traverse because the shortest distance as the crow flies between a village and the mother church, it could be like up hills or down dales or over cliffs or goodness knows what. And you just had to kind of muscle through. And the other school of thought was that the corpse road should be deliberately confusing so that the spirit couldn't find its way back from the churchyard. So these roads not only twisted and turned, but they tried to cross as many liminal spaces as they could. So they would ford streams or go over bridges or cross stiles or go through gates, because every barrier or threshold was a chance to confuse the ghost. This is quite common folk knowledge, actually. Spirits not being able to cross, especially water. If you think of vampires, they can't cross water. Or Talky again, the Black Riders at the Fort of Bnonnsense. Now, often these corpse roads weren't used terribly frequently. A lot of villages were small, didn't have a lot of deaths, and so they were kind of hard to make out. There are a few still extant in Britain, just as usually used as regular roads now, but most of them have just disappeared with disuse. But if you see a corpse light moving apparently at random through a marsh, it isn't just aimlessly wandering, it's following a corpse road or to or from the churchyard. Or at least that is the idea. Now, if all this sounds terribly pagan, yeah, it's fearing the dead.
A little bit.
Even the beloved dead is a pagan practice, and Neolithic Britain still actually has traces of its own corpse roads pre-Christianity, often straight kind of in segments, and this obviously informed the later practices. So if you think about Stonehenge and various barrows and these sort of famous big monuments, they're often connected by these corpse roads that you can still kind of make out. Christianity conquered Britain, but it was a very slow process, and syncretism with pagan religions and folk practices was endemic for a very, very long time, and to this day, really, in some places.
Well, this is very fascinating, and maybe we could do an episode on corpse lights sometime, especially since I recently wrote on ghosts, but what does it have to do with St. David, Smokey?
Well, in Wales, there is another name for corpse lights, corpse candles, and there is an uncharacteristically positive association with these creepy lights. The story goes that the people who lived around St. David, in his parish, as it were very worried about dying unshriven, that is, unexpectedly before they'd had a chance to confess. Which, come on, you defeated Pelagianism, and you're still like, what's going on here? Come on, make up your mind. But David, felt bad for this terrible state of affairs and prayed for his people to have some warning of their death so that they could prepare themselves. And in a vision, David's wish was granted, and he was told that from then on, anyone who lived in his land would be forewarned by the dim light of mysterious tapers when and where the death might be expected. According to one version, these were supposed to appear as actual candles, and the colour and size of the tapers indicated whether the person to die would be a woman, man, or child, which, would be helpful. But other versions simply describe the lights as balls of moving light. So these are obviously corpse lights. This is the same phenomenon.
So, just to be clear, you were supposed to infer who was going to die from the fact the light appeared in a certain area and was a certain colour. So if there were, 5 men and 3 women, and a light appeared that indicated a man was going to die, you just sort of hope it was the oldest dude.
Yeah, it wasn't sort of that specific. It would be at a household. But
I mean,
honestly,
you
could all go to confession. It would be very, very salutary.
Very good for your soul.
Yeah. So the light would appear at your household. It would gradually move towards, along the corpse road towards the graveyard, and it would disappear at the very spot you were supposed to be buried in. I suppose if you had a family plot, you might be able to determine exactly who it was if you followed it as well.
You could purchase your burial ground in advance,
just
so you'd be certain that it was you.
At any rate, people were apparently very grateful for this. This wasn't terrifying. This was like just a nice little boon. Now, of course, it's probable that this story is complete bunk, but it is still significant. And I think it's quite lovely that with the spread of Christianity came this new interpretation of what might be, for all we know, a legitimately paranormal occurrence. A supernatural worldview is a paranormal worldview. They could be real. And in this interpretation, a portent of death, which is generally considered terrifying, almost like a curse, is reframed as a blessing. And the lights as these kind of beneficent, almost like kindly guardians leading a soul to heaven.
It is interesting how Christianity turns the grave on its head. Why should you be afraid of the grave? Jesus knows his way out.
Indeed.
Well, this has been the tall tale of St. David, who no doubt is looking down from heaven and is remembered in heaven for having done less than half of these things,
Possibly as many as 10%.
but is remembered for having done away with the fear of corpse lights and Pelagianism.
He did
Go him. This has been Talky Nonsense.